June 26, 1943. Dawn broke over eastern England as a thin layer of mist clung to the grass at Halesworth Airfield. Pilots of the 56th Fighter Group moved through the fog like shadows, their breath hanging in the cold air. Among them was Captain Robert Samuel Johnson, a man barely 23 years old, but already seasoned by months of brutal escort missions over Europe. He walked with deliberate steps toward his P-47 Thunderbolt, the aircraft he affectionately named Half-Pint. Despite the name, the P-47 was no small creature. It was massive, rugged, and intimidating. But to Robert, it felt like an old friend. The briefing that morning had been routine: escort another wave of B-17 bombers deep into occupied France. Nothing about it suggested that Robert was about to live through one of the most miraculous survival stories in aviation history. Takeoff was at 0645. Engines thundered as dozens of Thunderbolts clawed into the sky, forming up like armored guardians above the lumbering bombers. The mission was simple in theory: keep German fighters away from the B-17s. In practice, it meant flying into the most heavily defended skies on the continent. For the first hour, the mission felt strangely quiet. Flak bursts were distant and lazy. No enemy fighters appeared. Many young pilots allowed themselves to hope for an easy run. Johnson did not. Experience had taught him that silence was often the prelude to violence. At 9:20 a.m., the violence arrived. From above, Messerschmitt Bf-109s dove like hawks, slicing past bomber formations. Seconds later, Focke-Wulf FW-190s swept in from the sides, shredding the sky with cannon fire. The air turned into a furnace of tracers, smoke, explosions, and burning aluminum. Johnson dove into the chaos, firing into a Bf-109 that was lining up behind a bomber. He hit it, watched it tumble away trailing smoke, then immediately climbed back to protect the formation. That's when he made the mistake.
A lone B-17 had drifted out of formation, its left engine coughing smoke. Two FW-190s swooped toward it like wolves closing on a wounded animal. Johnson didn't hesitate. He broke formation to chase them, diving so fast the airframe trembled. He fired on the trailing FW-190, forcing it into a hard defensive maneuver. But in doing so, he failed to see the second German fighter slipping behind him. It was a small mistake. A small mistake with catastrophic consequences. The first hint of danger came not from sight, but from sound. The sharp, metallic crack, crack, crack of 20-millimeter cannon shells striking armor. Johnson jerked the stick forward, trying to escape, but the German had him in a perfect firing position. Half-Pint was being torn apart. Cannon shells ripped open the right wing. The canopy exploded into glittering shards that sliced into Johnson's face. Wind roared into the cockpit, freezing, deafening, blinding. Hydraulic lines burst, instruments shattered, smoke filled the air. Johnson felt something hot across his shoulder. A shard of metal had buried itself into flesh. Blood ran into his eyes. He wiped it away with the back of his glove, but more took its place. He was hurt, and the airplane was dying beneath him. Any normal fighter should have fallen apart within seconds. Any normal pilot would have bailed out. But the P-47 Thunderbolt was not a normal airplane. And Robert S. Johnson was not a normal pilot. Johnson shoved the stick forward, diving steeply. The Thunderbolt picked up speed with terrifying momentum. 400 miles per hour, then 450, then close to 500. Most German fighters couldn't or wouldn't follow a P-47 into a deep dive, but this German did. The FWW-1 glued to him, firing precise bursts. He wasn't simply trying to shoot Johnson down. He was dismantling the machine, piece by piece. More shells hit the fuselage. One detonated near the instrument panel, sending fragments into Johnson's legs. Another blew apart the oxygen regulator. Glass, wires, and metal danced violently inside the cockpit. Johnson tried evasive maneuvers, rolls, climbs, turns, but the destroyed control surfaces barely responded. The Thunderbolt staggered through the sky like a wounded animal. Every movement took both hands and every ounce of strength he had.
The German kept firing, and firing, and firing. It was execution in slow motion. At some point, through the chaos, the firing stopped. Johnson, gasping through wind and smoke, dared to look back. The FW-190 pulled alongside him, close enough for Johnson to see the pilot's face through the canopy. The German studied the ruined P-47, at the bleeding American barely conscious inside it. Then, in an extraordinary gesture, he raised one hand and saluted. A silent acknowledgement between warriors. Then he rolled away and disappeared into the sky. German pilots later speculated he had simply run out of ammunition. Others insisted he thought Johnson would die anyway. But many American aviators believed the salute was genuine, a rare moment of respect in a merciless war. Either way, Johnson was alone, wounded, barely able to see, flying a machine that no longer obeyed properly, and 200 miles behind enemy lines. Johnson knew one thing. He had to head west. England was northwest. The sun would be his compass. Most of his instruments were dead. The ones still working were barely readable through smoke and shattered glass. Turning the aircraft was agony. The right wing wanted to drop constantly, where cables were severed and control surfaces mangled. He fought the stick with both hands just to maintain heading. Blood loss made him dizzy. The open canopy let in freezing air. He shivered violently, fingers numbing. The oxygen system was compromised. Breathing became difficult. He descended slowly to escape the worst of the cold, leveling off at 15,000 feet, high enough to avoid light flak, low enough to stay alive. Minutes passed like hours. Johnson muttered to himself to stay alert. He sang songs. He cursed. He prayed. Anything to stay conscious. After nearly 20 minutes, through blurred eyes, he saw it. The French coastline. If he could make it across the English Channel, he had a chance. But that chance was slim. Crossing the channel meant 80 miles of water, with no landing spots, no help, and no forgiveness. One engine failure, one blackout, and he would vanish into the waves. He pushed forward. German coastal flak erupted immediately. Black puffs of smoke exploded around the airplane, but he couldn't maneuver. He flew straight through it, trusting altitude and luck. Some flak tore new holes into the already butchered airframe. It hardly mattered. The P-47's skin had become a mosaic of perforations. The R-2800 radial engine, a marvel of American engineering, sputtered but kept turning. Of its 18 cylinders, several were dead, yet the engine kept clawing forward. 20 minutes passed, 30, 40. Then, at last, the horizon darkened. England. Johnson felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. But he could not rest yet. He had to land this mutilated beast.
Johnson spotted an airbase below. Manston, a major emergency landing field. It was perfect. His radio was dead, his flaps were gone, his hydraulics were non-existent. Landing gear had to be lowered manually, using a hand pump that required 100 grueling strokes. He pumped until his arms felt like fire. He counted each one aloud. 85, 90, 98, 100. But he didn't know whether the wheels had locked or not. He had to trust them. As he approached the runway, the battered Thunderbolt fought him every inch. The right wing kept dipping. He countered with sheer force, gritting his teeth, pulling back, keeping the nose level. The runway rushed toward him. The wheels slammed into the ground, hard enough to make him bite his tongue. But the landing gear held. The Thunderbolt rolled forward, helpless without usable brakes. He cut the engine. The plane coasted to a stop nearly half a mile down the runway. Silence replaced the roar of combat. Robert Johnson slumped forward, exhausted, bloodied, trembling, but alive. Fire crews and medics swarmed the plane, prying him from the cockpit. One medic stared into the shredded interior and whispered, "Good God, no one should have survived this." Mechanics spent hours examining the P-47. What they found defied belief. The aircraft had absorbed 21 confirmed 20mm cannon hits, 200+ machine gun hits, shattered canopy, destroyed instruments, failed hydraulics, damaged fuel tanks, half-dead engine, severed control cables. Several hits should have killed the pilot instantly. Others should have snapped the airframe. The engine should not have run. The wings should not have held. Yet the P-47 did not break. Republic aviation engineers were stunned. They used the damage analysis to refine later Thunderbolts. They strengthened armor, upgraded redundancy systems, improved fuel sealing, and made changes that saved many future pilots. Half Pint itself was lovingly rebuilt and used as a training aircraft. It became the symbol of what a Thunderbolt could endure. Johnson spent 2 weeks in the hospital. Cuts lined his forehead. His shoulder was pierced with shrapnel. He suffered mild concussion, blood loss, and psychological trauma. Nightmares plagued him. Cannons firing, the German fighter in his mirror, the cockpit exploding around him. Doctors recommended sending him home. Johnson shook his head. "I'm not done." He returned to flying in July. At first, flak bursts made him jump. FW-190s in the distance triggered involuntary tension. But slowly, through discipline and sheer will, he reacquired his edge. He began scoring victories. 5 kills, 10, 15, 20, 27. By 1944, he became the second highest-scoring American ace in Europe, surpassed only by his friend Francis "Gabby" Gabreski. But Johnson rarely spoke about his kills. What he spoke about was that June morning and how the Thunderbolt had saved him. "It kept me alive," he said. "It got me home when nothing else could." The story of Robert Johnson and Half Pint became more than a tale of survival. It became a lesson. For engineers, it was proof that robust design saves lives. For pilots, it was proof that you should never give up, even when all logic says you cannot survive. For historians, it was a rare example of skill, luck, and engineering converging in a single miracle. And for generations after, it became a symbol of the indomitable human spirit. Johnson lived until 1998, witnessing the evolution of aviation from propellers to supersonic jets. At air shows, old Thunderbolt pilots would shake his hand and say, "You gave us hope out there," because they remembered the battered P-47 that came limping home, full of holes, burned, shredded, bleeding, but alive. A machine that refused to die, and the man who refused to let it.